The promise that we receive through Christ that saves us, that makes us the righteousness of God, that allows us to stand in relationship with God, even though we have brokenness and sin. The challenge that we have is it's still a promise. I think it's in Hebrews 10:24, I think it is, that it says that through his sacrifice, that we are both perfect and being made perfect. That it says that we are perfected through the sacrifice of Jesus, and those who have been made perfect are being made perfect. Look at your neighbor and say, that's confusing. That's a little confusing. It's dual. It's working in our life in two different ways. That we are the righteousness of God when we choose to hope and believe in what Christ offers us. But there is also this reality that we are not in our own flesh perfect people. And what the scripture is trying to communicate is he's trying to help us understand what then does it mean for us to be saved by grace through faith. It means that we are both recipients of a promise that is current, that covers us, yet we are also called to look more like Christ in the way in which we live. That how we live like Christ does matter. We're actually going to dig into that on Wednesday night here in a few days. But this being perfect and being perfected, it's a problem for some of us. It's actually a problem for all of us if we're willing to be honest about it, because that process, it requires patience. Have you ever wished you had more patience? Have you ever wished you had more patience in your life, that you wished you were further along in your journey than you currently are? I was talking with somebody earlier this morning, and one of the things that's interesting about jobs in America is if you looked around 40 years ago, the average person, all of these people are retiring now, would have 1 to 2 places that they worked in their careers. But when Gen X and now millennials began to take the workforce, something shifted. Something shifted. Loyalty shifted. Loyalty shifted from a corporation that we worked with to loyalty to my pocketbook. And so we began about 25 years ago to see people shift from lifelong careers in one place to intermittently working at this place for 5 years and intermittently working at this place for 10 years. And you begin to see these shifts often based on quality of work-life experience, but also based on how much money they brought home. Why do we do that? Because for many of us, right, wrong, or indifferent, we don't have the patience to see if eventually we'll get the same money that we think we can get at a new job at our current job. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing right or wrong with that. There is, however, an issue when we talk about spirituality, because the difference in the decision is to live by my own philosophy or to live by a life that is driven by the words of Christ. Like, those are the two options. And I either choose to live my life and to receive what I want when I want it, or I choose to trust that Christ will bring me what I need in every situation that I run into. And when we choose to be impatient, when we choose to lack the willingness to hope in something better, we become tempted by getting what we want when we want it. It's why people can sit in church and instead of working on their marriage, have an affair or have an addiction to pornography, because they want their sexual gratification without doing the work of having a healthy marriage that Christ calls us to. It's why people can choose to have sex out of wedlock and choose to live with people and choose to do everything but have their marriage blessed by God in order to get what they want when they want it. And we'll make up all kinds of excuses for it. Whether we're talking about sexual sin or we're talking about sin in any other area of our lives, we'll choose our way in the moment because we feel like it makes the most sense right now. Impatience to wait for the promise that God has for us always leads us to sin. It always leads us to sin. And the challenge with that is that when we do that, we may be choosing something we feel is better or good, but we're missing out on God's best for us, which is always better. So how do we choose to trust the promise of God? I want to give you 3 thoughts today in our time together. The first thing that I have to do is I have to believe in the promise. Look at your neighbor and tell them, I gotta believe in the promise. Come on, tell them. Tell 2, 3 people, come on, tell them, I gotta believe. Don't stop believe. I'm just kidding. But no, you gotta choose to believe in the promise. It's interesting to me in the culture that we live in that we say we believe a lot of things that we don't. Have you ever caught yourself saying something that you say that you believe, but then you do the opposite of actions to it? How many of you intellectually will agree that McDonald's is an unhealthy place to eat? How many of you still eat there? Hello? Like, I pick on McDonald's a lot. If you're new, we talk about McDonald's a decent amount, and not just because it's the only fast food place in our town. Well, the only fast food place you can get a burger in under a half hour. Anyway, moving on. If you work at Sonic, deal with it. It makes your place better and we'll eat there. Anyway, it's just so long. Like the last time I went to Sonic, I was clean shaven before I ordered. You know what I'm saying? And I came out like this. Anyway, moving on. Y'all know I'm not wrong. All right. So we choose, even though in our brain, we go, this is not healthy. These are not good decisions. Yet we find ourselves in the McDonald's drive-thru. Why? Because there's something broken about our belief system. We like the idea to be able to pontificate about all of the ways in which this thing is not good for us, or our way of life is broken and how Jesus is better. Yet, and we'll talk about this in just a second, it's not actually my belief system if it doesn't change anything about my life. And for many of us, we struggle with this. We struggle with the choice to really, with conviction, believe that God's way is better. I have to choose to embrace that. For the people who are written to in the book of Hebrews, they're being told, hey, if you'll suffer some, I promise you that you'll find that Jesus is better. If you'll walk through a difficult season where you might lose your job for your faith, or you might lose some relationships because of your faith, I promise you on the other side, there's something better. So we have to choose to believe in it. The second thing we got to do is we have to embrace the promise. Look at your neighbor and tell me, you got to embrace it. Come on, tell them. You got to embrace the promise. There has to be boots on the ground action for how we choose to live and embrace the promise of Christ. It has to inform how we live our life. It has to change something about us. If you follow Christ and it hasn't changed your behavior, I hate to break it to you, you're not actually following Christ. You may come to church and you may enjoy it and you may do certain things that sound or look Christian. But if it doesn't inform your politics and it doesn't inform your morality and it doesn't inform like the day-to-day of how you live your life, you're not actually following Jesus. You might be like saved enough to like end up in a good spot in eternity, but a disciple of Christ you're not. It's why we can have people that sit in church and gossip about people 6 days out of the week. It's why people can have sexual relationships outside of the context of marriage and still show up on Sunday and somehow be able to rationalize that. And embracing the promise is about choosing to see that Jesus' promise is better and to see that the way of Jesus is better. And it means that I stop making excuses for the unethical things that I do or the unbiblical things that I do, and I choose to make the hard decision and change the habit and change the decision to sin. It means that even though I think the government doesn't need any more money, I still choose not to cheat on my taxes. Because Jesus, said, give to Caesar what is Caesar. It's the willingness that even if you disagree with something, even if you feel tension in your soul, that I choose to embrace the way of Jesus, because his promise for me is that I am the righteousness of God when I choose to allow him to continually perfect me in my life. That by his sacrifice, I am perfected those who are being perfected. And it's the better promise. And it means laying down some of the things that you think about life and some of the things that you think should be acceptable or should be the right way to do it. And being okay with saying, even though I don't necessarily fundamentally agree with the scripture in an area, I still choose to trust it because it's still the scripture. We tend, when we have a disagreement with the scripture, and we all have disagreements with the scripture. We all have disagreements with the scripture at some point. If you don't have disagreements with the scripture, that just means you don't read it, right? Like if you spend time in the scripture long enough, you're gonna find things that you go, I don't know about that. Is that just me? Just me? Oh, me, all by myself, all by myself. No, we all have these moments where we go, I don't know about that. But choosing to embrace the promise is choosing to make a decision to say, even when I disagree with it, I'm gonna trust it. And I'm gonna allow it to shape and mold how I live. The language that we see in the Old Testament, we talk a lot about letting the way that we live be shaped by Christ. We use that language a lot. And one of the most beautiful pictures that we see in the scripture is that in the Old Testament, it says that God is the potter and that we are the clay. And in order for us to be shaped into the image of Christ, it's kind of an all or nothing thing. That I choose to let him take me in my entirety and reform me and reshape me. The way that I think about family, the way that I think about life, the way that I think about money, all of those things, Christ has called me to embrace the way that he has called us to live. So if I want to trust in the promise and the way that scripture calls me to, I have to choose to believe it, I have to embrace it, and then the last thing I need is to rest in it. That I rest in it. What does it mean to rest in the promise? Can I tell you something? That if you find yourself anxious and worried and bothered in your life, it's probably because you've chosen to pick up something Jesus never called you to carry. So much of what we get anxious about, are things that are either things we're not supposed to carry or they're a product of our own sin. It's so interesting to me because people justify gossip. It's so interesting to me because that gossip leads them to worry about people and they think, well, I'm just caring for people. Well, no, you're actually not. You're literally engaging in rebellion is what scripture would tell us. And the result of you taking in gossip and putting it back out is your anxiety. And that's like, all our own fault, right? I know I'm not gonna get a whole lot of amens on that, Because we live in a small town, and let's be honest, that's like, gossip in a small town is like a sport. You know what I'm saying? Like for some of us, it's like just, who gets to know stuff first, right? But the reality is, we do things and engage in conversation and engage in worry about things that we were never supposed to engage in. And when we do that, what we're doing is we're sitting the promise that Christ's burden is easy and his yoke is light. And what we do is we set it aside and say, no, I think I have a better way. And the truth of the matter is that you don't have a better way. The better way is Christ. It's always Christ. It's always been Christ. The scripture says that God in the beginning gave the promise to the best one. He gave it to Abraham. And he gave him this gift, which was the promise to be passed down. And you may be sitting in here and think, well, I don't think my way is as jacked up as you're saying it is. It's worked how I'm living, how I've operated, how I've chosen to think about things in my life. It's worked pretty well for my family. We're not exactly falling apart. And it's not whether or not your way is evil. It's whether or not there's something better. I tell you, I've had a weird year. I've had some stuff personally that has just been chaotic. A multiplicity of things, not just one thing, not just two things. Like, I've walked through some crazy stuff. And if I'd walked through the things that I've walked through this year, 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't be in ministry at that point. Just being straight up honest with you. It probably would have done me in. But 5 or 6 years ago, this idea of embracing everything that I can that is Christ, and realizing that when I do that, that there is a gift of rest that comes from it, absolutely transformed my life. It absolutely transformed my life. And it's not that when I now go through difficult things, I don't feel it. But that when I go through difficult things, I can find rest and peace in it. And my hope for you is that you'll see that there's a better way. So that when you go through difficulty, when you go through things that are painful, you can still find rest. But I can't embrace my version of life and still expect the peace of God. It doesn't work that way. I have to embrace how he's called me to live, and how he's called me to think, and how he's called me to respond in my life. And out of that, I find rest. And I can rest in the promise that even though things may not be perfect, I've got something that's better.